So the origin of the session really, it does go to a conversation that Adam and the Alliance had earlier this year, where we were basically comparing notes. That we often get asked the question from state legislators, from governors, what do I need to do? What bills do I need to pass in order to get KIPP to come to my state, in order to get rocket ship to come to my state? And the foundation and the Alliance and others who work in this space, you know, we kind of have our list of things that we talk about with folks, but it's really based on anecdotal conversations with CMOs. So we thought, you know, it would be great to actually interview, you know, 15 to 20 of the highest performing CMOs in the country and find out from them what policy factors and non-policy factors are most important to you as you think about expanding into different regions and in different states. And so today we hope to share that information with you. I want to give a little bit of Charter 101 before we dive into this too deeply. My sense is most people are very familiar with this, but I always find it helpful to just remind folks that charters are public schools. They don't teach religion, they don't charge tuition, and they don't have admission requirements. These are public schools. And when a lot of states passed their initial charter laws, they had in mind, I think, the first charter school that was created in the country in St. Paul, which was started by a couple of longtime public school teachers who were frustrated with the system's inability to serve kids who were dropping out, and created a school to specialize in preventing kids from dropping out, bringing those back in who have dropped out. But really was a single school created by public school teachers to better serve kids in the public education system. And so most charter schools across the country are nonprofits set up to operate a single school. But early on in the charter school movement, we saw some organizations established for profit to manage schools. And a lot of these organizations started with, in Edison schools is the one I remember the most. It started with sort of a mindset of, we want to open up 200 charter schools all across the country in 5 years. So they started out with these really ambitious plans. And we saw so what happens in those situations is you have a nonprofit that still is created to start the school, and then they contract with a group like Edison or Mosaic or some of these other for-profit firms. I think that part of the movement has stagnated to some degree. There's still some operators who are continuing to grow, particularly the full-time virtual ones. But the for-profit part of the sector is there, but it just isn't growing as much as the third part of the sector we're going to talk about today, which are charter management organizations. And if you really look at how most of these were started, it was a couple of public school teachers who got together, and whether it was in Houston or in Connecticut or in New Jersey, and started a school to serve a group of kids in a particular neighborhood, and had great success and had a waiting list, and said, well, why don't we open up another middle school in the city? And to me, this is really one of the interesting innovations in charter schools. Is for a long time you hear conversations about how in a city there are oases of excellence, where everybody can point to the 3 or 4 really great, high-performing public schools, but they really can't figure out how to do more of them. I think in the charter model, you've seen a number of different organizations start a great school and then go open more of them in that community. And so it's really helped accelerate the creation of more great schools. And that, at the end of the day, I think is the goal here. And the last thing I'll say before I turn it over to Rebecca is, I think, you know, a lot of policymakers that we talk to really want to create the kinds of policy environments that will attract these charter management organizations. But I think it's important to remember a couple of things. One is every state that has a charter law is trying to bring these folks in. So there's a huge demand and there's a very limited supply. So that means as you're thinking about how do we get more great charter schools in our state, you know, we definitely encourage folks to do whatever they can, both policy-wise and non-policy-wise, to bring in high-performing CMOs, but at the same time, you have to be working as aggressively to help local folks start great schools or help local folks replicate and expand their models. So really think about a broad strategy. And how that plays out will really differ depending on what the context is in your state. But, you know, I think do everything you can to help the high performers come in and replicate and expand, but at the same time, do everything you can to help local folks create great schools, even if it's just one school in a particular neighborhood. So, but we really want to focus in on how to find and attract the best CMOs. And so what the foundation and the Alliance did was turn to Bellwether education partners in DC and ask them to conduct a survey of about 20 really high-performing CMOs, and Rebecca Goldberg, who's a partner with Bellwether, is going to present the findings of that. And then after that, we're going to hear from a couple of other really smart folks, Kristoffer Haines, who's a partner at Ampersand Education. He can say a little bit more about his extensive background in this. And then we're also going to hear from Allison Serafin, who's a founder and president of Opportunity 180, which is a harbor master in Las Vegas, and she's going to say a little bit more about the role of harbor masters in this space. So, Rebecca?
Great. Thanks, Todd. I'm excited to be here today for the official unveiling of some of the initial survey results from the surveys and the interviews that we've done with high-performing charter management organizations over the last few months. And Kristoffer Haines, who will talk next, and his colleagues at Ampersand have also been partnered with us in designing a survey that would get at the really great questions that we'll spend part of our time discussing today. So, what I want to talk a little bit about, this is much of this is what Todd has said, and don't want to spend a lot of time here, but want to just highlight that when we set out to design this survey, have these interviews, learn from some of the highest performing charter management organizations around the country, we really wanted to understand what does it take to attract these CMOs to your city or state, and how are they thinking about growth, right? So there are movements all over the country. Allison will talk more about the work in Nevada to attract these high-performing charter management organizations to new cities or new states. But until now, we haven't had a comprehensive picture of whether charter management organizations are interested to going to new states and new cities, and in what ways. So, when we worked with the Alliance and ExcelinEd to identify a bunch of the CMOs that many of you are hearing about and asking about in your day-to-day conversations. How do we get KIPP to come to our region? How do we encourage Aspire to grow? What does it look like to get a great idea public schools in our neighborhood? So these are the folks who responded to the survey and who worked with us to generate this data. The survey and the interviews fundamentally covered 6 big questions that I'm going to spend just a little bit of time walking through. Today you're going to hear the highlights. By the end of the year, you can look for a publication from ExcelinEd and the National Alliance that'll give you all the good details on what these folks said and sort of how they're thinking about these questions. But fundamentally, we were looking at 6 key questions. How and when are CMOs planning to grow? What are the key policy factors that CMOs think they must have in place in order to go someplace new? And as Todd said, just as importantly, what are the non-policy factors? And then more specifically, many of the questions that we hear all of you ask are around funding and facilities. What does that support actually look like? We know CMOs care about funding and facilities, but what do they actually care about? And then what does the human capital ecosystem need to look like? And finally, what are the preferences that CMOs have, or the must-haves that CMOs have around governance and authorizing? I'm going to spend a few minutes on each of these. So the folks that we talked to operate in five regions, and just over half of them operate schools in 2 or more states. So you get a sense from this. I'll give you a little bit of other background statistics on these folks. The folks we spoke with about and who participated, just under half had fewer than 5,000 kids. So to ground things here, the Broad Foundation's definition, in order to be a CMO, qualify for their prize, you got to have 2,500 kids. So almost all of the organizations that participated in the survey meet that threshold. You can see in the midpoint average for the funding that the funding is pretty significant standard deviation from the low to the high there, but on average, folks responded that they had a per pupil all-in of just about $10,000. So here's the first part that surprised me in the responses. What we hear from many of you is that it's very difficult to have the opportunity, when you have conversations with some of these organizations, to get them excited about opening in a new region in the short term, that they're very focused on their near-term expansion in existing regions and existing cities. But when we asked them folks what their expansion plans were, 80% of the CMOs that we surveyed say they're willing to expand to a new state within the next 10 years. 58% of these folks say they're growing at a moderate pace, though, as opposed to a rapid or measured pace. So I think the message here is there's opportunity, and these folks are looking for kids to serve and communities to thrive in. Everybody's opening new schools. This is a pretty key part of the theory of change for most of these organizations, that they want to have the opportunity to serve more kids and to do this work with communities. So a couple things that became clear about what doesn't drive CMO decisions to grow. All the CMOs, small, large, in between, indicated ambitious growth goals. It was actually remarkable to see how consistent folks were in terms of their willingness to grow and the percent by which they are interested in growing. And everybody's basically open to growing out of their current geography. What did matter as we looked at the data in terms of their willingness to grow and what would create the conditions for them to grow? At a high level, and I don't think any of us in the room who have been doing this work with communities will be surprised by this, folks are looking for communities where they can make a difference, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like. They're looking for a set of autonomies, and they were very consistent on the autonomies that they feel like are must-haves, and we'll talk about what those are. And then there was a real focus on funding and facilities support, human capital supports, and some really clear perspectives on what a great authorizing environment would look like. So I said there's very clear perspective on the autonomies that CMOs are looking for in the survey. Remarkably, 100% of survey participants, so all 19 of the organizations who participated in the survey, identified 4 things as must-haves before they were consider going to a community. One is that they must be able to independently manage their budget. Think about the way folks do business and accomplish goals. That seems pretty intuitive to many of us. 2, they needed to be able to choose their own curriculum materials. 3, they needed the power to hire, evaluate, train, fire, and promote their own staff. And 4, they need the opportunity to set their school culture. And when they talked about culture, they talked about things like their ability to define their discipline system, their ability to think about how they wanted to frame what the goals of their school were, what their school model was. You can see there's some other ones here that rated high. What was interesting and also was the things that were not rated as highly. So folks are open to, and we're going to talk about this, a pretty wide range of authorizing agreements. They're open to, from an autonomy perspective, they understand that they may have to work within some state systems as long as it's not those 4 that are featured on the upfront. Not surprisingly, and I think Allison will touch on this when she shares her remarks, folks are really focused on making sure that they'll have access to the startup capital that they need to be able to open a set of schools within a region. So we saw very clearly that CMOs think really hard about going to regions that have demonstrated philanthropic support, particularly for that startup gap when they're first opening their schools. And I think the other thing here that's surprising, right, is not surprising, is that folks are really looking for places, again, where they can create more opportunity for kids and for families. So they are looking for places where it is clear that there are inadequate educational options for kids. Unfortunately, those of us in the room know that that's pretty common among a pretty wide range of communities right now. So there's the money numbers. So for those of you like me who are wonks and who enjoy the finance, this is going to be exciting. We asked folks, what's the minimum per pupil that you need in order to operate effectively? And I think this, not surprisingly, as you think about this, we're asking this question of folks who operate in a tremendously different range of per pupil. So places like Nevada, which Allison will talk about, places like California have a per pupil on the very low end of this, in the 6-7 range, whereas some of the Northeast CMOs are operating in an atmosphere in which their per pupil is significantly more than 10,000, and the cost of living, cost of facilities is commensurately higher. And so what you'll see here is a pretty wide range, but this average and sort of mode coming in right around the 10,000 mark, and Allison will talk more about her conversations with folks on that topic. I think the other thing that is, again, not particularly surprising, but important to think about as you consider the opportunity to attract CMOs to your state is the idea that, folks are saying, about half of folks are saying that startup funds, that capital is just absolutely critical. We know facilities are a common pain point. So in our work at Bellwether, what we often see is that people say facilities are the #1 pain point that CMOs and charters face as a limit to expansion. That and human capital, which we'll talk about in a minute. So clearly facilities is a common pain point. Everybody said that in the survey, but there's not a real clear consensus on what the answer to that question is. About 58% of folks say We really need access to facilities, like we need you to find us the building to make sure we can access it. And a little less than half said, what we'd really just like is some more money, and then we'll figure out where the facility should be. You'll see on the right, like, again, pretty wide range of perspectives on exactly what that facilities funding looks like. That big sort of ugly beige bar that's missing a label, that's no preference. Not surprisingly, human capital is the other thing, along with facilities, that we have all heard a lot about when we talk with CMOs that are looking for expansion. And I think broadly, folks really highlight the importance of being able to see a clear pipeline for hiring high-quality teachers. Some, but not all, CMOs use the presence of TFA as a real proxy in thinking through this one. That's one where it's important to know that that's not how all operators think about it. There's pretty wide diversity, even in the folks that we surveyed. And then two, I actually thought it was interesting that this, the idea that it's a desirable place to live was actually not super high on folks' lists. Like, I think they are compelled by the idea that they will figure out how to do the work in a community and figure out how to inspire and motivate a team, regardless of sort of the nice to live aspects of the location. You can see TFA, number one source that folks look at as they think about how human capital. But I'll just note here, if you talk to another CMO like Great Hearts is a CMO that started in Arizona, has a presence in Texas, they'll actually say that TFA is extraordinarily unimportant to their strategy as they think about growth. Kristoffer's going to talk a little bit about how these consensus numbers across CMOs, not always reflective of the particular needs of particular CMOs, but you can see that TFA, veteran teachers, new teachers that they train themselves, all pretty important sources of human capital. We hear for questions from a lot of policymakers about the impact of collective bargaining on CMOs, and what we saw was about 70% of the CMOs that we talked with said that requiring participation in collective bargaining agreements would be a real problem or a real barrier for them to consider doing the work. All right, so authorizers, favorite topic of some of us in the room probably. As we talked to CMOs, what we saw was that just about 80% of folks surveyed have a real preference about the type of authorizer options available. And so as they think about which kinds of communities to look at, which kinds of states they might consider going to, this is often one of the threshold questions that they're asking. That said, most folks in their comments then reflected a preference for non-district authorizers, and in the discussion we can talk a little bit about why we think that's true. And then finally, in terms of authorizer practices, we saw a pretty clear, this is really interesting as you think about CMO's desire to grow rapidly to serve kids. About 80% of folks see that it's quite important to have a really clear path for expansion and replication within a region. So an idea or a KIP or a rocket ship is not going to pick up from one location and move to another location in order to open one school or in order to open two schools. They're looking for a pretty clear pathway, assuming that their high quality student results continues in order to be able to open multiple schools within a given jurisdiction. The other thing, obviously, that you see here is in some states what we see is a lot of restrictions on composition of the board, and we saw pretty clearly from the survey results that CMOs were really focused on ensuring that they could sort of control the composition of their board. So what does this all mean? There's a couple things I want to highlight in terms of what we saw as key consensus areas, but then again, I want to turn it over to Kristoffer to talk about how some of the data here, the majority data, can mask some of the very real differences that different operators think about. The good news, I think, for all of us and for kids in this country, CMOs are planning to grow. They're willing to consider new states, and many of them are actively in the process of doing that. Some of the things that we thought about as relatively typical charter freedoms, we talked about curriculum, we talked about culture, are pretty essential to their ability to do that work effectively. Startup funding matters, and human capital matters. And then I think the other thing from an authorizer perspective that was really clear was the importance of, again, as I said, being able to have multiple schools within a new region and being able to maintain a simple board structure. There's a lot more interesting stuff in this data, and again, if you're a data wonk, I hope you'll stay tuned for the full report that will be released by the end of the year. But what I want to do now, this is going to be much more interesting if folks around up here are having a conversation and talking about, agreeing about, disagreeing about what the implications of this are for states, for CMOs, and for kids. So that said, I want to turn it over to Kristoffer, who'll talk a little bit about his role working with folks on the ground who are doing some of this work and the implications of this for them.
Great, thanks Rebecca. Good afternoon everyone. My name is Kristoffer Haines, and I've, in my entire life, my entire professional life, I've been in ed reform. I taught for 2 years. I spent 8 years with KIPP, both KIPP Foundation and KIPP schools, 4 years with Rocketship, and then the last 2 years as a partner with Ampersand Education. And we kind of play both sides of this, where we work with CMOs who are thinking about growing, finding the right match, the right city, all the implications and challenges that go along with that, and then also working with harbor masters and city funds to help them think about crafting their strategy to work with the existing schools in their community as well as the new schools that they want to recruit. What I want to spend a little bit of time on just thinking about how this data is informing what we can do today and moving forward is just step back a little bit and think about kind of where we've come from. I think both the folks in this room and the CMOs in particular have become much more sophisticated over the last 12 years. When I started at the KIPP Foundation in 2003 and we were thinking about growth, there were 3 criteria. We needed facilities, we needed funding, and we needed a fellow. And there was no big, Bellwether didn't exist, and we weren't doing a bunch of data and research. If somebody said they wanted to go to Buffalo, we went. Or Asheville, North Carolina, we went. Or Gary, Indiana, we went. And those were all places that KIPP actually did go and no longer has schools because we had somebody who wanted to go there. We didn't really think about what level of funding or what the facility strategy was going to be. 5 years ago, when I was at Rocketship and we were leading our growth and really thinking about where we wanted to go and why we wanted to go someplace, I would say we had a more half-baked process of really understanding what the governance options were or the authorizer options. We knew we wanted to go in and have an impact, so we need an authorizer who would approve multiple schools up front. We knew how much it was going to cost for us to run those 8 schools, so we understood where we needed to be with the facilities allotment or the funding in general. We still made a ton of mistakes. We still made poor choices, but we were thinking a little more deliberately about where we would go someplace and why. And now today, work very closely with Idea Public Schools as they think about their growth strategy. And a year ago in 2014, we started the conversation with them about where they may go in 2018. So really thinking 4 years from now, where do we want to go? Why might we want to go there? Let's assess all the options, and really looked at 20 cities across 17 states, and really dug into the very specific nuances of the charter law, the policy environment. Is there a harbor master or not? And so, I think we've collectively come a long way in thinking about how this works. And one of the things that I think is just interesting is, we spend a lot of time thinking about how we can fix challenges now, or how we can recruit CMOs. And while we've been focused on the here and now, kind of over the last 15 years, it's been this kind of gravitational pull towards some places as opposed to others. I think the South is a good example where Tennessee and Louisiana certainly a draw for large CMOs. In part just because places that are right to work states, those are a huge draw for folks in CMOs, and in the Midwest, not so much. It's much more challenging to recruit talent and to be there. And this happened not because Right to Work was an education platform. It actually happened for other reasons. And so there's been this ground softening that has kind of allowed certain places to be more attractive to CMOs than others. And now the folks in this room and others are thinking about how to take advantage and leverage the work that they can do to really recruit and retain large CMOs or high-performing CMOs. There's an outlier to this in Indiana, who has a phenomenal policy environment, really focused on recruiting the best to Indiana, and they've been able to do that really by focus of 8 to 12 years. Education has been a priority, and I think if I were to think about one thing, like education can't be a trend. It really has to be a priority for the work you're doing as policymakers in order to be successful. And given where CMOs now are, given how they're thinking about their growth, they don't want to go into a place that 4 years from now is going to change because the governor that they thought was strong and the board that they thought was strong at the state no longer has it as a priority, no longer is going to be as supportive as they were when they weren't in the building. And so as we work with CMOs and we really think about where to go, the policy environment is key. One thing that has struck me over the last kind of 12 years and currently is a trend now is once you get on the ground and you really think about which CMOs you want to recruit and where you want to go to seek them, it's very relational. So you go back to the page where all 20 of those folks are, potential, growth opportunities. They're thinking of going someplace, and there's another 20 who aren't on this list. There's a right size and a right fit on both the city side and the CMO side that I think is really important. And so, if you are Memphis or you are Milwaukee or you are Sacramento, really think about what your policy environment is, what sort of inertia and momentum you have, what sort of political capital you have, and who are the right fits to help you solve whatever the problem may be in your city. And so you may have a ton of land, and so greenfield opportunities or free facilities is something you want to do. You may be an ASD, an Achievement School District, or an RSD, and so you need turnaround operators. And so, KIPP is a good fit for some of those, and Scholar Academies or Mastery is a good fit for others. And so really thinking about how to match make so both the CMO and the city can be successful, I think is critical. And 12, 15 years ago, that wasn't the case. I think cities were pulling and CMOs were pushing, and some have been more successful than others. But really thinking about what the right fit is, I think is kind of like the next phase of this, and being opportunistic and thinking about how to have, let Allison talk about this a little more, kind of like anchor tenants. Like, you don't need all 20 of those folks. You need 2 or 3, and those 2 or 3 should be the right ones for your city, depending on what your strategy is. Then it's really easy, or it's easier, to find the policy thorns in your side or speed bumps to just kind of be specific about, we're going to increase our funding and we're going to figure out the facilities thing. Not, we're going to do facilities, we're going to do funding, we're going to do governance, we're going to do human capital. I think the ability to focus on the 2 or 3 policy changes you need to make your environment right for the 2 or 3 CMOs is critical. And over the last couple of years, the idea of the Harbor Master and the work that Harbor Masters have been doing has, I think, actually really been the spur and the catalyst for a lot of this. Somebody who's in the middle really thinking about doing the matchmaking on the city between the CMOs and the policymakers. So I'll turn it over to Allison, who is recently founded and phenomenally successfully launched Opportunity 180, because I think there's the really great symbiotic relationship that the Harbor Master plays with both the CMOs and the policymakers.
Thank you, Kristoffer. I love that there was phenomenal success in launching the nonprofit. Now we just need to pull it off, right? We need to ensure that our children in Las Vegas have access to great schools. So hi, everyone. My name is Allison Serafin. I am the founder and president of Opportunity 180, a Harbor Master in Las Vegas, Nevada. And I also serve as vice president of the State Board of Education in Nevada, but today I'm going to wear my Opportunity 180 hat. A few years ago, I moved to Las Vegas, actually 8 years ago. And in that time, I have had the chance to see firsthand how the opportunity gap is impacting our community. And so to back that up, I was a Teach for America teacher in 2001. I was with Teach for America on staff for about 7 years. I had the chance to work in the Clark County School District as a consultant to our district superintendent. And through my career, my adult career in education, I just have continued to get more and more frustrated and outraged, quite frankly, around the growing opportunity gap. And specifically in Clark County, we have 330,000 children in our district and charter public schools. And we have 82,400 children in failing public schools. That's nearly the same number of students in all of Denver, PS. And so when we think about the magnitude of that opportunity gap, you begin at some point to enter the juncture of frustrated and inspired, and you need to pick a path. And so over the past year, I chose the path of feeling inspired by the opportunity to create new schools for our families in poverty. And so in creating this nonprofit, I taught at Yes College Prep. I had the experience firsthand of working in a school where all of my students lived in poverty, and all of my students were proficient on the state test, and all of my 7th graders went to and through college, all of them. So when I think about Eddie Zapata, and I think about Ismar, and I think about Myra, I know firsthand that this is possible. And so living in Clark County and seeing 58% grad rates in high schools with 3,000 kids, It's just fundamentally unacceptable. And so I reflected on my yes experience. As you can imagine, when you're at the juncture of frustrated and inspired, you call your former principal at Yes College Prep and you say, hey, what would it take for you to come to Las Vegas? And you quickly learn through conversations that our highest performing operators, as Kristoffer has shared and as the survey indicates, are really sophisticated. And I use the analogy around economic development. If you want the best companies to either expand to your city, move their headquarters, relocate, you all know that takes a considerable amount of time. You also know that companies tend to have terms and conditions in order to make that leap. And recruiting the best charter operators is very similar. And prior to launching Opportunity 180, and I appreciated Kristoffer's kind of understanding of the context because it was about cash, talent, what city wants us. Now, charter operators are looking for someone to coordinate the effort around all of the elements that matter most to them that will set them up for success. Not much different than the way companies look at economic development authorities in particular regions to make the decision of whether or not they relocate or expand their businesses. And so Opportunity 180 is considered a harbor master, and this philosophy comes from a group called Education Cities. Guys, I did not make this up. I can take no credit for this theory of action. In launching Opportunity 180, I called a lot of really smart people. I talked to Nirav at New Schools New Orleans. I called the Charter School Growth Fund. I reached out to Mind Trust in Indianapolis. And I wanted to learn, like, what is it we need to be doing in Clark County? And I was told, well, you need a harbor master. Now, folks, if Las Vegas, Nevada can have a harbor master, then anyone can have a harbor master. Because ask yourself what body of water would lead people to think that harbor masters are a naturally intuitive term to recruit great charter operators. Lake Mead is great, but we know that in the spirit of terms, it may seem silly, but I think it actually articulates the role of the work of coordinating all of the efforts in a challenging environment in order to ensure that we're ultimately successful for kids. So these are the four kind of theories and priorities. These are the four priorities that Education Cities has determined harbor masters need to embrace. Now, one thing I want to provide context to is, as you all consider how you recruit charter operators, I encourage you to first figure out the problem you want to solve. In Clark County, for instance, we have a huge opportunity gap, as I shared. 82,400 children in failing schools, and 77% of those kiddos are Black or Latino. And so we have a moral responsibility to ensure that those families have access to great schools. But we also have a state per pupil amount at 6,500, far from the 10,000 average. We're way on the other end of the spectrum. So how are we going to create the conditions? And so for us, we've designed a harbor master strategy similar to the way you may design an economic development strategy around it's not just about importing. We also need to develop. We all know the power of small business in our communities, so we have the same philosophy around how do we develop and recruit great leaders that want to launch high-performing charter schools so that we ultimately can create an ecosystem of great schools, knowing we need a lot of those anchor tenants. And when I say a lot, it's not around the volume of tenants, it's around the volume of seats. So we know that operators want to expand, and so we would like, in Clark County, to have 1 to 2 operators that would ultimately serve 10,000 low-income students. But I first suggest you figure out the problem you want to solve so that you then can identify the operators that you can recruit and align your philanthropy and state initiatives accordingly.
So, Allison, what keeps you up at night as you think about launching this? And, think about just sticking to the attracting the CMO piece. You know, what keeps you up at night in terms of like, how am I going to get that done in order to bring these folks in?
I mean, I think ultimately knowing as we sit here there are children in failing schools, that is the headline that keeps me up at night. It's the urgency with which we need to engage in this work, which is why I found this report and the survey so important to always ground us, and we always want the best for our kids, right? And there are clearly tier 1 operators out there that we want in Clark County, but we don't have the conditions right now that enable us to be competitive. with a Baton Rouge that has 11,000 per kiddo and free facilities, or a Camden right now that just has a tremendous amount of attention and capital and talent investing there. But what we do have is a significant percentage of local donors that have committed initial philanthropy that have enabled us to partner with BES, Building Excellent Schools, so that we can launch our first school in 2017. The stuff that keeps me up at night regarding that work is ensuring that we have the conditions in place, not just to launch our first set of schools, but that we have a sustainable path of policy and capital that enable us to create 25,000 high-quality seats that can sustain the test of time, that can sustain policies and politics, that we really can provide this proof point for our community and for families to demonstrate that all children can achieve. We just haven't provided them with the excellent schools that they deserve.
Kristoffer, I want to ask you a couple questions. One is, were you surprised at all by the openness to growth from the CMOs? Because what I hear often in my conversations with them are, you know, we really want to do well in LA, we really want to do well in, you know, you name the city, as opposed to like, yeah, I'm interested in maybe going down to Alabama or, you know, wherever.
I wasn't only in that, like, I think it's shifted a lot probably in the last, 24 to 36 months. And I think what, we are all very aware of is while there are, 58% of students graduating from high school in Las Vegas and what, 25% of your kids are in failing schools, unfortunately, that's probably not much different than most cities that people sitting in this room live in. And so when you're a CMO, the opportunity to serve students in need across the country is very real. And, we've all kind of coming from this world in which, we want to be able to provide good opportunities for everyone. Thank you. I can get closer. Good opportunities for everyone, no matter where we are. But if you are a CMO, what I think is interesting is, Rebecca, you said, look at all these CMOs that want to grow. But if you're a CMO, like, the world is your oyster, right? Like, you have all of these places, and finding the right match and finding the right place is critical. And so, when you're sitting on that side of the aisle, really thinking about what are your priorities, what problem are we trying to solve, let's find the one or two who can really help us solve that problem is critical. And I think you see this 80% of yes, we want to grow, but you don't see a lot of growth because we're in this place now where I think CMOs are really trying to figure out what the right mix and match is for them to be successful. Because let's be honest, like, running schools is hard enough day in and day out. Growing schools and running them well is even more complicated. And the last thing we want to do is be unsuccessful in a new community because nothing hurts both the movement or the community or the children more than that.
And I think there have been some early challenges on that front, right? And so we had the chance to talk with some of those folks that we'll spend more time talking about in the report, but there are certainly examples across the country of CMOs who made sort of quick decisions to grow or thought about an opportunity and then have had to pull back from that city, have had to reduce their growth plans. And so there's, I think, a appropriate humility moving forward among operators about how important this is for kids and families to get this right.
Yeah, it seems that there are just a small number of cities where this approach is actually taken to scale. Obviously, New Orleans is a very unique set of conditions, but Memphis is another city that comes to mind, which has tried to both support local folks who want to start schools, but really aggressively attract outside organizations to come in. And I think there was actually a very unique thing there, as you had Chris Barbick, who founded and ran Yes Prep, go there, and the relationship thing, I think that maybe Kristoffer mentioned, is very important. I'm not sure how many other people could have recruited those organizations in that Chris did, just because of his personality and his relationship. So, Kristoffer, I'm wondering if in Rebecca too, if you could talk a little bit about Memphis and some of the challenges that have happened there, because a couple of providers have gone in, and at least one of them, Yes Prep, has said, we're out. And sort of what can we learn from that as some other places think about this, to Allison's sustainability point?
Rebecca, you want to maybe just start macro, and I can maybe share a little more from the CMO perspective?
So I think one of the things we see in this survey, right, is that there's a bunch of different ways that folks can open schools. So some of the CMOs will only open schools, they can open 1 grade at a time or 2 grades at a time. Some of the CMOs are willing to do turnarounds with certain conditions. Some of the CMOs are willing to do turnarounds with without a lot of conditions. And I think one of the early things I take away from Memphis, right, is that it's actually quite important for a CMO to define where they stand on that, so what their perspective is on how they can open their schools and grow with quality. So I think that's been part of some of the requirements to enter Memphis, right, have sort of said to CMOs, like, there's a certain way that in order to get the free facility, in order to enter here, there are some choices we need you to make around your ability to open with more than one grade at a time. And so in the survey, we see pretty consistently that folks are starting to be aware of some of those challenges. So I think that's one, is like, the movement needs to have a clear perspective on what is and is, you know, both states and CMOs need to have a perspective on what is and what is not okay in terms of their ability to open schools effectively. I guess the second thing I would say from a macro perspective about some of the early challenges in Memphis is this work is really hard and is really specific to different CMOs, and Kristoffer will have the on-the-ground perspective to talk a little bit about this, but in some cases there were just, you know, a set of conditions that folks needed to meet or not meet, and I think folks maybe went into those conditions, and because they hadn't replicated yet, they didn't realize how challenging that was going to be in some cases. I don't know what you would add.
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of things that I like, just, you know, like, particularly the Memphis case. So at least from the CMO side and the ed reform side, let's be honest, like, humility is not our greatest, like, character strength. You know, like, we think we can go in, we think we can be successful, we've done it here, we can do it elsewhere. And I think in a place like Memphis, you know, when you think about turning around schools, when you think about running a community school, you know, Yes Prep, for example, has done, you know, kind of one grade at a time growth in Houston, incredibly successful. Going into a new community that serves a very different demographic and population to do a full school turnaround, that is that's just a very different way of running schools. They could be successful in doing so, but I think really knowing kind of who you are from the CMO side, what works for you, how you want to grow, how you want to be successful, is something that we're kind of collectively becoming much more sophisticated about. Like, you know, you kind of got to know yourself before you can get out in the world and be successful. And I'm not picking on Yes Prep because there are others in Memphis and other places who have done the same. But for me, really thinking about, you know, this from the community perspective and really thinking about how we can be successful is, I think, something that we've just had a little bit of an aha about, in a way that's probably, you know, not been very flattering, but, you know, is something I think we just need to own so we can get better and move on.
Allison, and assume, given I know some of the folks in the room here, there are plenty of questions, so folks could start maybe raising their hand if they have questions, or actually come up to the microphone, I'm sorry, and we'll start pulling in audience questions. But I wanted to ask Allison, there's the last point on your slide is around community engagement, and one of the big, I think, unintended consequences of the strategy of bringing in CMOs from outside the community is created a lot of tension, even in places like New Orleans, where the system, or the public education system as a whole, is much better than it was before Katrina. There's a lot of tension within the community between folks who live there versus folks who come in from the outside and start schools. And I think we see this tension in Newark. I think we see this tension in Memphis. I think it's been part of it. So I'm real curious, you know, are you addressing that issue in Vegas? Are you seeing some of your other partners in education cities address this community engagement issue so we don't face the same problem in these other places that are going to start to go down this road?
I mean, it's such an important question, given that it involves our families, right? And ensuring that we're operating in partnership and with respect of our communities and not doing things to them, but with them. It also reminds me of in my 7th grade classroom, we had a pre-AP theme that said change creates conflict and adaptation. And that was the entire theme throughout all of 7th grade. And gosh, it is so true in education, right? Change does create conflict and adaptation. My thinking around this has evolved quite a bit, Todd, and to operate like as a truly vulnerable leader in this space and launching a harbor master. So initially coming to the space and talking to other organizations that were in the work of creating the conditions in great schools, specifically serving low-income families, there was a lot of conversation around how you get families to go up to session and lobby for a particular piece of legislation, and how you can mobilize families to basically serve a particular agenda that would be aligned to the work of a harbor master or another entity. And my thinking in this has evolved quite a bit in that when we really think about engaging the community, the agenda we have should be around great schools, right? This isn't about charter, it's not about district. We don't have a clear agenda in communities that empowers parents and families, regardless of their zip code or the color of their skin, to know that they are entitled to excellent schools. They're entitled to that. They can be at board meetings demanding from their school board that they should have 5-star or A+ or whatever it is that your state uses in their neighborhoods. And so in this thinking process, I've been working with other organizations and learning from organizations that are approaching their community engagement strategy in more of a campaign-oriented partnership way, and communicating and working with families around this entitlement to great schools, and then providing families with the knowledge and skills to know how to advocate and what the power and privilege dynamics are in order to have access to be able to demand that, as opposed to it being about, we want this school or we want to pass this bill. We really need to create communities where all families feel entitled to excellent schools.
So much of the conversation, given the focus of the CMOs, is about urban areas, but I think we all know there's a huge need in particularly impoverished rural communities. And I know, looking around the room, there are folks from states that, you know, have an urban area or two, but really have a pretty large part of their states that are more rural, where there's as great a need for better public schools as there are in the big cities. I'm just curious if that has come up at all, Rebecca, in your discussions or thinking around this. And Kristoffer, as you've talked with CMOs and others about expanding to serve more needy kids, obviously there's huge parts of the country that aren't very densely populated, but that still have huge needs.
Yeah, so I mean, I think there are a couple of operators who are doing that well. I mean, Idea Public Schools is probably first and foremost. You know, I mean, they're serving over 20,000 kids in the Rio Grande Valley and, you know, South Texas. Incredibly, you know, rural area from, you know, Donna all the way down to Brownsville, which, if you know your southern Texas, you know, geography, is, you know, a couple hundred miles, and not a lot of very densely populated people. I think, you know, Baton Rouge, as it continues to grow, is going to be a place that is, you know, Baton Rouge itself is not large, huge need, but the rural area kind of, you know, between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, you know, very needy. You know, there's some work going on in Idaho, and Rebecca, I know you guys are doing some work there as well. So I think from the CMO perspective, rural isn't off the table as much as, so rural's not off the table. I think the biggest challenge for CMOs is like the ability to scale in a place where you have to cover so much ground. It's, you know, again, it's hard enough just to run a school, but you think about supporting those schools in the back office, particularly when you with on the ground, you know, academic staff or, you know, business operational staff, you know, the ability to be able to get to places and be supportive, support teachers, you know, support the business staff is I think one of the biggest considerations. I believe, or I think in the next 5 years, we're going to see some of these operators think about going outside the urban core more, particularly once they've, you know, we become a little better every day at kind of refining, you know, how we run the business of schools and how we serve students well. The idea of scale, the ability to serve students at scale, whatever that may mean, is going to expand. That would be my hope.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's right. I would just add, you know, so two things. One is, in the survey we asked about the requirement for an urban area or the requirement for a rural area, and folks were surprisingly agnostic about that. And I think that, again, that's because I think within a given state, folks are going to need the ability to scale within a given region. I don't think that necessarily means within a single city. I think IDEA is a great example of a strategy that is like many different small municipalities. Think about Republic Schools, which made an intentional choice to grow to be the first operator, and they're in Tennessee right now. They've just opened schools in Mississippi. And their strategy over time is going to require them to not just be in sort of highly populated urban areas.
I have one more question, and then I'm going to start calling on certain people in the audience who I know are working on this. It's in the questions about money. I think we've each talked about money to some degree or another, and I'd like you to kind of break it out between sort of what state policy can do here in terms of the operating money, categoricals, facilities, all that, versus the startup needs that CMOs have when they come into a Milwaukee or a Jackson or wherever?
So again, I kind of think, going back to, 12 years ago when we were at KIPP, when we said, facilities funding and fellows, the funding was really the state per pupil, right? Like it needed to be 8,500, and then we would kind of, just figure out the rest. I think now we're much more thoughtful. Allison and I have conversations about IDEA and Opportunity 180 about like the startup costs are going to be X just to launch schools. We need to build buildings and we need to, hire staff, and in this case, we need to get them on the ground 3 years in advance before there's ever a student in a seat who is, receiving the state and federal, per pupil. So I think that, CMOs have become much more sophisticated about really nailing that upfront cost. And then, we don't want to be raising money forever. So the per pupil is a very real, kind of benchmark. And depending on your model, that can fluctuate. I mean, as you can see, there are plenty of schools that are, successful in California on their $7,500. And, you're not going to tell anyone in Washington, D.C. or New Jersey that they could ever go to California, because how in the world would they possibly operate on half of the per pupil? But they do, and plenty of schools do. So I think the per pupil is very real, but it's relative to who the operator is and how they want to run. So the biggest thing where I think there's a lot of movement, of course, like, more money for education is always important and, going to be critical, but the places that are starting to think strategically around facilities funding, facilities allowances, those to me are the places where just if I were a policymaker, I would think about how to subsidize and find those dollars rather than just the straight per pupil, because that's the place where, as we think about building new schools or taking over schools that need $10, $15 million renovations, some charter management organizations have, leveraged $100, $150 million in debt, and that actually does stop the growth and the scale at some point. So, of course, the per pupil needs to rise in some places, but, really thinking about, offsetting the cost of facilities, which the traditional school system does not have, as, a thorn in their side, is if I were sitting in your seats would be one of the things that I would really, pick off first.
Yeah, one of the things that strikes me about the survey findings are there's some policies there that are just good for all charter schools, whether it's, a group of folks in a particular community, they should have the autonomies that, a CMO should have as well. But there's some things that are very specific to the CMO needs that have nothing to do with somebody who's just running a single school. And so, Rebecca, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the governance piece. Like that was number 2 on that one slide. And what does that really mean, and what can a state policymaker do because that is such an important thing, I know. And some CMOs won't even touch certain states like Minnesota because of their governance requirements.
Right. So as I think about our work over time with single site or small, charters with 1 or 2 campuses versus the work with the folks that aspire to have 20 or 30 or 40 schools or campuses over time, I think this is the thing that really differentiates the charters from the CMOs. So I think you're right about that, Todd. So this number 1, this clear path for regional expansion and replication. So again, 80% of participants in the survey saying this is a must-have. This is about, are there authorizer policies that enable CMOs when they get to a region to open multiple campuses and know that they are going to be able to open those multiple campuses without lengthy authorizing processes, without a long wait of time to show test scores for year over year on year. And so this is something that some of the authorizers have been really thoughtful about how can we create that path to enable these folks to get to the scale that they need, really like financially and programmatically to be able to do what they need to do. So I think that's the first part of it, is really this idea of a CMO is a different thing. Like they are looking to serve a lot of kids in a place, right? So they are not looking to have a great school that does one particular thing, which I think in some cases, charters started as innovation, like let's think about all these different things. I think the other thing, if you think about governance, so this is this third bar around boards that can govern multiple schools. If you're an operator, I have heard a story about an operator in which they operate in a state in which each school has to have a separate board, and there can be overlap of no more than 3 board members on each of the school's boards. And so they operate more than 20 schools at this point. And so you can imagine how many board members they have and how keeping that math straight. So what they do in one of the communities, one of these communities that they have multiple schools, is board night is the same night. They all meet in adjoining rooms of a school. And so essentially, like, one board meeting starts at 6:30, and then it ends at 7:30, and then the 3 board members from that board who are part of the next school board go to the next classroom, and then they start that committee. And so this isn't about a lack of democracy or about a lack of desire to have participation in governance. It's been a fundamental part of schools in America to have school boards, but it's the idea of how can we create circumstances where people can be successful in terms of operating multiple schools in one place. The other thing that I'll say about that is just the importance of expertise. As Allison has referenced, operating a CMO with 20 schools, a very different thing than operating one school, small business versus large business, right? So the kind of expertise needed from a board perspective, the kind of fundraising expertise needed, the kind of community engagement expertise needed for a charter management, for a CMO board and for the schools within that CMO, pretty different than the expertise needed on a regular, a single site or a double site charter board. And so thinking about those differences and being thoughtful about how policy enables that is pretty important, as the data showed.
Sir?
Greg Senders, North Carolina. One policy question and then one information question. How much in your research did the initial charter period play in the ability to attract CMOs? And then secondly, looking at the Nevada bill, it looked like there were public dollars, around $5 million put into it. Mm-hmm. Is there any required private match? And then what's really the role of the harbor master? Is it helping with the application, recruiting boards? What's the role for the harbor master to play?
Do you want to answer the first
I'll answer the first question just from the CMO perspective. So it's less about the length of time, 3, 5, 10 years, than is about the process. So it's just like we don't want to have to completely reapply or start from scratch 5 years in. If for the last 4 years at the point we're applying, like, we have been an A+ school or 100% proficient. So it's more about I think having a process for those who are high performers. I don't want to call it expedited because that makes it seem like you're just rubber stamping it, but a process that really separates like the due diligence from really understanding if a school is successful or not. We don't need hoops to jump through. So if we have to do that every 3 years, that's fine. But let's just make sure that if we're successful, it's relatively painless. Certainly longer is better, but even from the CMO side, there are a couple places that are 10 or 15 years. That seems like bad policy to me for those who are not high performing. So I think it's less about the length of time and more about perhaps the tiers in terms of the due diligence on the policy side.
I think in the last part of what you said, you raised something important around the idea of it is in CMO's best interest, high-performing CMO's best interest, to have an authorizing climate that ensures that you're getting rid of not good schools and keeping good schools, right? Yep. And CMOs know that, and so they want authorizing policies that reward high quality, high performance, and take real action to ensure that kids aren't in failing schools, whether those failing schools are charter schools or district schools. So the Wild West is not the right solution.
Right.
And Texas did something a couple of years ago to differentiate on the renewal side of things.
Right.
And created 3 tiers. Basically, if you're a high performer, it's expedited. It's very quick, and if you're a low performer, you're going to be closed automatically. And then everybody in the middle has to kind of go through the standard process, which I think is an interesting sort of idea to think about. And then some other states have tried to reduce timelines for schools that are coming up for renewal who are high performing, and why make them go through the same extensive process as opposed to just a expedited one. So, and Allison, do you want to answer the harbor master question?
So Nevada is the first state in the nation to have a harbor master bill. So this bill passed this past session, which allows a nonprofit that identifies itself as a harbor master and that it's charged with creating high quality charter seats focused on serving low-income students. And the bill provides a $5 million match each year, up to $10 million over the biennium. The RFP hasn't been released yet, but the belief is that you need to have 5 million on hand at the time of the RFP to get the full match. So yes, there is an expectation of a private match. And in all seriousness, like what makes this exciting is I find it to be the perfect blend of public-private partnership. We have a clear need and interest in Clark County, which is where Las Vegas is located, from philanthropists to want to engage in systems change. And the idea that our state leaders are working in partnership with our philanthropists to create systems change is just really exciting. And I find that increases the accountability of taxpayer dollars. Because I don't know about you, but if you raise 5 million from donors in your community, I'm gonna bet they're gonna be on you like a pony at the fair to make sure you are spending every penny in the right way to change outcomes for kids. And I think that is the exciting part of what Nevada is doing, is thinking boldly around how to serve our families. And your question around what a harbor master does, I think that depends on every city. And the work we're doing in Las Vegas, I consider us a full service recruiter and developer of high quality schools. So we have a due diligence and sales process in identifying the operators that are going to enable us to help solve the problem of inequity in Clark County. And then we have a process of, once we identify those operators, ensuring that all of the terms and conditions match, right? So whether it's the per pupil, it's the governance structure, it's the policies, it's the facilities, we need to find out what matters most to the operators that we want to come to Nevada. And then it's our responsibility to clear the brush and ensure we meet those terms and conditions. In addition to that, we know that we can't hang our hat on just waiting for a charter operator to choose Nevada. So we're also working with Building Excellent Schools to create a charter leader pipeline where we'll develop our first school launches in 2017. We expect 3 schools to launch every year thereafter, so that we're gonna grow our own talent leadership force. And in that group, we expect a few to be franchisable, that we may have a few CMOs that will come to create 2,500 high quality seats. And in addition, we also have an achievement school district. We also know there's an initiative across the country around private schools with our ESAs in Nevada that are serving low-income students, but ultimately it's all of the ecosystem creation, philanthropy, facilities, talent, policy, and community engagement to ensure that we have excellent schools for all families in Clark County.
So if you're not in a state where you can raise a lot of private money, are you just SOL? Are there other things that you can do to attract folks in? Because it seems, I mean, to me, there's a lot of pieces to the New Orleans story, but one of them is huge amounts of public and private money that went in there, which is not replicable anywhere.
I mean, is there a state like that? I mean, seriously.
That can't raise money?
Right.
Or that doesn't have private money for startups?
I mean, you look at a place like, you can say, well, Arkansas, but yeah, Walton's based there, and Idaho, but Albertson's based there. Like, I don't know if it's like, I don't think philanthropy is our problem here. I mean, it's just my take. I don't think philanthropy is our problem. There's no lack of money. There's no lack of rich, people who are willing to help education. So
Let me take you to Mississippi.
Here's where I have some disagreement with that, is where you see a significant amount of national foundation money going into particular markets. And I come from the philosophy that money attracts money. And there is this catalytic flywheel that emerges when national foundations, and I think of Race to the Top, right?
Yeah.
So there were some conditions that emerged with significant cash that attracted a lot of operators. In a market supply approach, when you want to recruit operators who then are also being courted by other cities that are providing 12, 13, 14, 15, 16,000 per pupil, free facilities, bonuses for teachers, there are sometimes we're priced out. And so I don't think, and I don't operate in a way where it's like, aw shucks, like we don't have a shot. It's thinking, okay, where do we have the greatest opportunity, and how can we continue to steward operators so that when the money runs dry in a particular region and they're at a place to be self-sustaining with the per pupil, that we're then poised to be able to recruit those operators. Because in the world of economic development, it is a significant long game when you're trying to recruit tier 1 businesses in any function or facility. So It is much more challenging with 6,500 per pupil. I mean, the bottom line is, and Kristoffer and I have worked together, just to give you a story, there is a tier 1 operator that we really wanted to come and expand to Clark County, and they were really interested too. And this was a year-long, and I refer to them as courtships. This is like a year-long courtship. We flew their CFO out, we flew out and visited their schools, and ultimately, it didn't pencil out. We couldn't close the gap around per pupil funding. It would have been an additional $3,500 a year per kid into perpetuity. And so the money does, even on the philanthropy side, our donors were like, no, we can't fund that over the long haul. So I do think that if you're a region that has a challenge and you don't have anyone coordinating philanthropy, you need to figure out how to coordinate all of your private giving pretty quickly in order to attract operators.
I guess I think there's a really important theme in what you said around momentum, right? So I think there's a number of, I can think of a couple examples, New Mexico, San Antonio to some degree, the work that you're doing in Nevada, that are places that are not inherently necessarily, if you look at what people said, were the things they're looking for, super attractive, but because of the relentless efforts of folks like Allison, folks like Matthew Randazzo and Choose to Succeed in San Antonio, that they have gotten traction, and that they're in Victoria Rico in San Antonio, that they have gotten traction, and that things are happening in those places. So I think there is a hurdle. I don't want to deny that there is a hurdle, but I do think that some of what Allison's doing can help mitigate that. People like to be courted. People like to have, and that's not just about human nature, although it's partly about human nature. It's also about the fact that having a person, a set of people who's going to stand with you side by side, help you navigate the bureaucracy, help you figure out what community members you want to talk to, engage with, like that's real value. And so thinking about how to make that happen in a community is pretty important. I would say it's necessary, but not sufficient.
So I think we have time for one more question. Emily?
Hi, I'm Emily Schultz. I'm from Alabama. And so we're at about a $5,600 per pupil. So we're operating with some of those same constraints. I have just a really tactical question. When you're thinking about answering those questions about where need and fit, and who needs to be at the table? I mean, is it parents? Is it district folks? Is it data people? State Department? I mean, I'm very, very tactical, specific question.
Yeah, so I think initially you need to know the landscape in your state, right? So you clearly know your per pupil. You need to understand what your state law allows for facilities. You need to understand what your talent pipeline looks like, the universities that are producing teachers and the caliber of talent that's being produced in state, as well as to the earlier point that was mentioned also on the slide around Teach for America and the degree with which they're growing and how are they continuing to get support. So you basically look at this is why I love this survey. We clearly know what matters most to operators from this, and then you really get to be the mastermind of your market to know where you kind of do your own needs assessment. Like, how does Alabama currently deliver based on these terms and conditions? And then from there you prioritize, right, from that scale of what matters most, and identify the problem you want to solve, right? So the degree you have relationships with your state superintendent, your local, I would say if you were to power map your community, who is it that you think would need to be at the table in particular in Alabama and making significant philanthropic or policy decisions around systems change? I think you're the best person suited to answer that. In Nevada, for instance, it really came from donors who I had worked with through Teach for America and in the school district that came to me feeling really frustrated around the fact that they weren't seeing change happen fast enough, and wanted to know what more they could do in order to ensure that kids were getting access to great schools. So that was the order of operations for me and that call to action. But it could easily be you on your own framing the theory of action for your local community to build investment. But it sounds like you're suited probably to create the theory of action and then get people to buy into that. But ultimately, I think that it's you power mapping your community and knowing best who would need to be at the initial table, and then you get your early adopters and coalition build.
And I think from the CMO side, really, again, kind of going through this is what our charter law says, this is what we're able to do. We are a mostly rural community, understanding, the South. So then thinking about who's operating in Louisiana, like who's operating, Kip Delta in, Arkansas. Like, think about, Memphis, think about operators where, my guess is like the Northeast and the West Coast are just not a good fit initially. And, identifying, the 3, 4, 5, folks locally, and by locally I mean regionally, who can, are interested in having the conversation around, a rural state that is nearby, serving, the population that is very similar to what they're currently operating. And, that's where I think it really becomes relational in, who you're courting, who you're having conversations with. And I think it's important too to like, once you kind of assess this is our policy environment, this is what the reality is now, I think thinking really strategically about, but this is where we want it to be in 3 years, in 5 years, and 10 years, and moving toward that together. I mean, we've seen real movement in a lot of places in the last 5 or 10 years when you get somebody who, has a, head of steam and an agenda and is at the intersection of frustrated and inspired. Like, you get there and you say, look, it's not great now, but in 2 years we're going to do X, and in 4 years we're going to do Y, and in 6 years we're going to do Z. And there's an argument to be made, like, I mean, people want to be a part of a winning team. There's an argument to be made to say, it's not perfect right now, but we think this is a good fit. Well, let's push this together. And I think that, I mean, speaking of human nature, I mean, that happens as well. And we've seen that in, we've seen that in a handful of places.
So last question, and then we're going to break for reception, dinner, both. Is real quick, one policy and non-policy recommendation for folks to sort of think about, take away the one most important policy and non-policy recommendation to take back to their state and move forward on. Allison, we'll start with you.
I mean, selfishly speaking around, the most important policy that I'm learning in Nevada is ensuring you have a really strong per pupil base so that schools are in a position to forecast their finances and that you have a clear idea around where you can recruit in those schools that are a right fit, and then those schools, quite frankly, you're kind of priced out of. So I don't ever speak to operators that get over 10,000 per pupil because we are priced out of that market. So I think a strong per pupil with the message around the fact that by not having that, it does prevent you from being able to engage and developing a marketplace of really high performing operators. The non-policy question just has to do with investing in talent. So as a state, to the degree that you have young talent or anyone committed to wanting to engage and change, ensuring that you're really nurturing and facilitating that leadership so that talent doesn't feel they have to leave your state in order to create great things, that people really find a place in your state to launch great things for kids there.
So I would say on the policy side, to me it's governance. So all of the high-performing CMOs are going to think really strategically about how they can run and operate their model, which you have identified as kind of wanting in your state to be successful. So that could be, having a single board. It could be, an authorizer that will approve multiple schools up front. But really thinking about the governance structure, how money flows kind of back to the headquarters and how they run their schools. So that's the thing that I think there's pretty unanimous, everybody that kind of I've worked with and we currently work with, everybody's thinking very thoughtfully around a streamlined governance structure. So that would be the policy side. On the non-policy side, I would say of the 40 high-performing CMOs in the country, my guess is there's a fit where 2 or 3 are just right for you, and do the work to find the 2 or 3 that are really going to help solve your problem, identify your problem with you perhaps, push forward a strong policy agenda, and serve your community well. I think the big is you don't want all of those. In fact, you probably don't want 95% of them. And really doing the work up front to identify who is going to partner with you and serve your community well is it's critical to me because I think we've learned a lot.
So I would have answered governance and authorizing for policy. To throw another thing in there, I think looking hard at what your options are for facilities from a policy perspective. So thinking about what opportunities you as a state or whatever policymaking role you come to this work in terms of use of facilities that are not being occupied right now, use of bond authority that regular public schools have. There's just a bunch of different facilities mechanisms, but it is clear that there is a facilities policy play needed. From a non-policy perspective, I would say thinking about how to, this goes to the Alabama question, thinking about how to mobilize and engage the community in the conversation about what's the question or the problem that you're trying to solve with this work. Because I think increasingly, in part because some of the challenges in Memphis and other places, operators are getting appropriately focused and demonstrating more humility about the idea of, Allison said, is doing this work with communities. And so these operators want to go to communities where communities want them to come and where they see a fit with parents and with kids. And so I think doing some of the work to understand what communities need and what communities want up front is really powerful in this work.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody, for coming. Help me thank our panelists for a very good discussion. And enjoy the rest of the conference.